Hello and welcome to another YouTube video here on my channel. I've been doing a little bit of a string of commentary on Time Life commercials, and this one's for apparently for I guess a book collection called The Vietnam Experience. This was done in the 1980s, and I'm not really going to comment on this. I'm trying not to comment on this very much because I feel like this commercial really has a lot of seems kind of thought provoking about the topic of the Vietnam War. That's of course you could say infamous war or something like that in history our where the United States provided military support to South Vietnam to try to halt the progression of communism from North Vietnam, to prevent the takeover of South Vietnam. That was based on the belief of the domino effect, where apparently, I guess, our government or I guess our politicians had believed that if South Vietnam fell to communism, that all of Asia would fall to communism, and that apparently it'd just be a domino effect. Country after country after country would fall to communism. I guess a more modern analogy. To better explain this is, I guess if you're a Star Trek fan, you'll know what I'm referring to. Kind of like the whole idea of the Borg in Star Trek, trying to assimilate Earth, which is basically the home planet, capital planet of the Federation. Obviously based on the idea, well, if if the Borg managed to assimilate Earth and they assimilate the Federation, that there'd be a domino effect to be able to pretty much conquer the Alpha Quadrant. That's pretty much closest, I guess, analogy I could find, to better explain the domino effect for Vietnam, or for the whole idea of the a domino effect that our politicians had believed that would happen in Vietnam should it fall to communism. And which it really didn't. I mean, actually, even after Vietnam being totally conquered by communists, the domino effect really didn't really happen. Maybe a very small handful, a couple of countries close to it fell to communism. But most of the world didn't fall to communism, in fact. But this is a commercial from Time Life Books for Vietnam Experience. And again, I don't want to provide much commentary. I'll provide a little bit of commentary afterwards. This is a very interesting commercial as a cute little kid, asking his dad's questions. But anyway, let's watch.
Daddy, what's Vietnam?
What's Vietnam? A question a child might ask, but not a childish question. A question that in the past has led not to answers, but only to other questions. What were we fighting for? Why didn't we just drop the bomb? How could we fight an enemy we couldn't even see?
Did all those people die?
Time Life Books and Boston Publishing present The Vietnam Experience, the series designed to answer the nagging questions.
Did we win the war, Daddy?
Each volume looks at the war
That
from every
boy's
point of view.
posed some pretty good
No matter where
questions.
you stood, you'll gain new insights into your own position, as well as those you may have opposed. You'll attend secret meetings at the White House and walk into an ambush to draw enemy fire. From Khe Sanh to Chicago to Saigon, you'll be there, learning much you didn't know about Vietnam, and much you didn't know about America.
Why did we fight the war, Daddy?
Call toll-free and start putting the Vietnam Experience into focus with Combat Photographer. You'll see what it was like over there from a perspective the media couldn't provide. An historic perspective that only now are we able to consider. It is important that we honor and remember those who gave their lives for our country. But honoring isn't enough. Remembering isn't enough. We must answer the question, what's Vietnam? For ourselves and for the next generation.
Will I have to fight in a war, Daddy?
Actually, that final question posed that by the little boy, him asking, "Will I have to fight in the war, Daddy?" maybe that, maybe that kind of hits you in the heart or something like that. Maybe it kind of, provokes provokes, kind of thought, thinking, about Vietnam. And I guess Vietnam, has, when you talk about wars, or you read about wars, I think Vietnam is probably the one war that you don't really hear a whole lot of uh, glory stories about. Like World War II, you hear, riveting stories about, battles in that war, about heroism and all that. Uh, and the boy actually, had posed some good questions like, "What's the Vietnam War? Did we win the Vietnam War?" And here, let me see if I can go back here and see if I can find those questions. And
a question a child might ask, but not a childish question.
Daddy, what's Vietnam?
Yeah, but it's a cute little kid. It's obviously, it's an instant question.
A question a child might ask, but not a childish question.
Which I guess, probably, maybe a boy might ask that, they might ask that question, and probably, maybe, or probably would have asked that question during this time period. Because you consider, even in the 1980s, back in the 80s, the Vietnam War was still kind of recent. Wasn't,
a question that in the past has led not to answers, but only to other questions.
Back then, Vietnam was a, kind of a recent war. And it was you could say it was a bloody war. You could say it was a very unpopular war, because it wasn't, I don't think it was exactly a war that, I don't think a whole lot of people here, especially here in America, wanted to go into. It's a little different, like World War One, or even World War Two. There was, those wars. For example, especially World War Two. Obviously there was a big reason to go to World War Two. Back then, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and so in a way, kind of woke the sleeping giant in us, in the United States. It pissed us off. It got us, rearing for a fight, rearing to kind of fight back and, take it to the Nazis and take it to the Japanese. There's a war, obviously there's, not many questions like, well, why did we fight the war? Well, obviously we fought the war to defeat the Nazis. We wanted to stop Hitler from, wiping out the Jews. We wanted to, stop the fascism, prevent Hitler and the Nazis from taking over all Europe. We wanted, it's obviously the questions, but for Vietnam, there's, of course, there was a lot of questions, and, a lot of those questions probably aren't so easily answered because, it's a lot of thought-provoking questions, and, like, here's some questions like the narrator posed.
What were we fighting for?
Well, that's a good question. What the hell were we fighting for in Vietnam? Well, you could say, well, we were trying to stop the flow of communism. We were trying to stop communism in its tracks. We were trying to keep South Vietnam from falling. Yeah, that didn't work out too well, apparently because...
Why didn't we just drop the bomb?
Well, obviously, there's a big reason why you didn't want to drop the bomb. I mean, that's actually kind of a good question. That's actually kind of a question I could easily answer. Why didn't we just drop the bomb? Well, because the Soviet Union also probably had bombs, and if we dropped the bomb in Vietnam, Russia, Soviet Russia, would have probably retaliated. It wasn't like back in World War II where, we dropped, where, where we dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to stop, World War II. We were kind of, technically, we were the first ones to actually use nuclear weapons, and technically, the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they were powerful, of course, compared to today, or even the bombs that may have been developed, nuclear weapons that may have been developed in the Vietnam War, and especially today, of course, probably makes Hiroshima, the atomic bombs used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki look like little firecrackers. But obviously, I can easily answer that question. We didn't want to, why couldn't we just drop the bomb? Well, one, it's collateral damage. Two, it would make us look really bad. Number three, you kind of provoke things with the Soviet Union, and there'd be a whole nuclear war exchange, and that would be the end of humanity as we know it. And think if you really want to, and I'll say this, like, if you really want to know, get a taste of what nuclear war would most likely possibly be like, I would recommend checking out the movie called Threads. That was a British nuclear war movie done by BBC. I think it was 1984 or 1985. No, in the United States, we had also done a movie there was a movie done in the United States called The Day After, but Threads, I think, was a little bit more realistic, mainly because the British had experience in those kinds of about being bombed. Excuse me, but that's actually a really good movie. Very powerful movie to watch if you're wondering, what would happen in a nuclear war, what mostly could be like. But it's like one of those movies that you would only want to watch once and be like, okay, I'm good. It's not like one of those movies that you watch over and over again. Anyway, that's an easy question to answer.
How could we fight an enemy we couldn't even see?
That's another good question. And I'll explain the basis of that question, probably in case if you don't know. Of course, if you're, you're probably young, if you're around my age or even younger, you probably, maybe you've learned about the Vietnam War a little bit in class or in, school. Vietnam, you could say it was a war that you could say that we kind of got our asses handed to in that war, maybe in a sense, because technically, because the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, the communists and, the North Vietnamese communists, that was their home turf. They have jungles. You might think jungles are just exclusive to South America or whatever, like Amazon rainforest. No. They have jungles. Vietnam has jungles too. And the thing was, back then, the United States did not, or probably does not have much experience in guerrilla warfare. Not gorilla as in gorilla the ape, as in apes, gorilla as in like, it's spelled differently. Where basically the North Vietnamese, soldiers, Vietnamese enemy soldiers were able to fight in the jungles, and of course they know the jungle. That's their home turf, that's like, like their backyard, they know, probably knew every square inch of the goddamn jungle. And where for Americans, for us, for our soldiers that fought in Vietnam, they didn't know much about the jungle warfare. They weren't experienced in jungle warfare. Most of our warfare usually, in the earliest days of our country's existence, was done on battlefields, and then you have like World War II, where it was done at beaches or even done in in cities or whatever, something like that. War for how our army fought war, like in say World War II, compared to Vietnam, was completely different. We were kind of out of our element, I guess you could say. But it's very possible that we were out of our element. Try to fight in jungle warfare where we had no experience in, but yet the enemy Viet Cong and the communist North Vietnamese have tons of experience in. So I think that's basically where that question came from.
Did all those people die?
Yes, they did.
The series design.
See if there's another question. Oh, hold on. There's actually another question this boy asked me. Interesting.
Questions.
Did we win the war, Daddy?
Well, let me see if I can answer that question. I know technically the cute little guy was asking his dad that question, and of course that's a question probably most people ask. Did we win the war? You could say that we didn't win the war, but then again, we never really actually declared war on North Vietnam. Like, we didn't actually, I think the last time we actually declared war, at least as far as I remember, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm, I think it was in World War II. Now, I'm not sure if we did declare war against Iraq in the first Iraq war back, when George H.W. Bush was in office. But at least as far as I know of, the last time we actually officially declared war was in World War II, and we declared war against Japan. I think we also declared war against Germany, but I think we mainly declared war against Japan. But in the Vietnam War, we didn't really... I don't think we really declared war in Vietnam. So we can't... So that's why I would say, no, we didn't... Can't say we didn't win or lose the war, because then we never really declared war. I think we did provide military support to South Vietnam. And, of course, we fought, the Viet Cong in there. But I think the reason why people might say that we lost the war is because the North Vietnam managed to conquer South Vietnam and assimilate it. And I know I'm using the kind of sense, assimilate as in taking over that country and turning it into a communist country and unifying Vietnam under communist rule. So essentially they assimilated South Vietnam. And I'm using a term like the Borg, like in Star Trek, but I guess it kind of makes sense. They assimilated South Vietnam, turned it into a communist, pretty much unified Vietnam under one communist country. But I think if I remember correctly, and I might, and I probably have to do more research on this, or if, somebody who knows the Vietnam War better than I do, could probably post a comment here, maybe better explain the situation. I think if I remember correctly, if I remember my history correctly, we managed to, or at least we thought we did manage to negotiate a truce between North and South Vietnam. And so from that point, we were able to, I guess we could say, okay, our job here's done. There's a truce. We got a truce. Let's go. I mean, it's kind of the same thing we did in the Korean War. I think the Korean War, I don't think we declared war in Korea, in the Korean War. We fought in the Korean War. But again, they signed an armistice. They signed a truce, to kind of, put the war on hold. Technically you could say that technically the Korean War is still ongoing. well, I'll say tactically because there hasn't really been any military actions between North and South Korea, for ever since the Korean War, kind of they signed armistice. But I think it was I think it's because we managed to kind of somehow get a truce negotiated between North and South Vietnam that we felt our job was done and that we could pull out of that war, or out of Vietnam, out of that war. Of course, by that point, people did not want, our country to be in Vietnam anymore. Obviously, the longer the longer it drew out, the war just drew out more and more and more, the more unpopular it became. Of course, especially the 60s, just by the 60s, it was just extremely unpopular.
Each volume.
Let me see if I can find
to Chicago and much you didn't know about America.
Why did we fight the war, Daddy?
Well, I think we just explained. I think, I covered that a little bit earlier in the video. Why we covered the war. Again, it was trying to prevent a domino effect from happening.
An historic perspective. And
I
those who gave their
really
lives
want to
for our
read this
country.
book because I think it'd be interesting, really, to.
But honoring isn't enough. Remembering isn't enough. We must answer the question, what's Vietnam? For ourselves and for the next generation.
And here's a question that really kind of, you don't know how to answer.
Will I have to fight in a war, Daddy?
And I wonder how the father will be able to answer that question. Hopefully, I think, if I was the father of that little boy, I would say, if I would say, hopefully you never have to. It's like, ask, will I have to fight in a war, Daddy? And, probably my answer would be, well, hopefully, son, you never have to. That's, of course, that's kind of a pretty loaded. You can say that's kind of a loaded question. Not really loaded as a negative load, but it's kind of loaded where it's very hard to answer. But yes, the Vietnam experience, Vietnam War was very, and I guess you could say controversial, but it was also, you could say it's infamous. It was definitely a war that really didn't help as much in matters, economy wise, or anything like that. Because think back in World War II. Technically World War II, us going into World War II, and in a way not only pulled us out of the Great Depression, but by the time we were done with World War II, our economy was in excellent shape. And that was because back then we had manufacturing and, we were building, wartime equipment and all that. But I guess Vietnam, I think, was a different story. Wasn't exactly the same way, and to anybody who's, I'm not sure if, anybody who's watching this video has ever served in Vietnam, if anybody is watching this video and is a Vietnam vet, thank you for your service, and I really do mean that. Excuse me, because Vietnam, obviously, of course, was, it's one of those wars where, again, it's, there's plenty of veterans that came from Vietnam. Excuse me. They're still alive, but, it was definitely a lot more grittier, and it's probably a war where you can't really, where you don't really have a lot of, like glory stories about. Like, World War II, you can probably hear a lot of glory stories. But of course, wars, of course, Vietnam was in, you could say it was an ugly war. And of course, any war is ugly. I mean, I'm sure first, the Revolutionary War was ugly. I'm sure the War of 1812 was ugly. I'm sure the Civil War was ugly for the people, for the men who fought in that war. Any war is ugly. There's been movies that depict war, that really kind of do, considerable job in, displaying, as wars what it really is, that, that's ugly and that's, just, terrible and everything. I think, oh, there's actually a really good Vietnam, there's actually a good war movie based on Vietnam. I think it had Mel Gibson in it called We Were Slow. I think it was called We Were Soldiers, and I think that's actually based on a true story. I forget the name of the general or the colonel that Mel Gibson portrayed, but it's actually a really good movie. But yeah, I mean, Vietnam was, of course, just an ugly ass war. It didn't really help us matters, and terms, in terms of fighting communism. Of course, the domino effect, which I think politicians at the time feared would happen, actually, in fact, didn't happen the way like we thought it would. Maybe that's why we fought in Vietnam, but again, it was just an ugly ass war. And of course, having the Soviet Union, kind of helping North Vietnam, have China and the Soviet Union helping North Vietnam, kind of escalating matters, because of course the Vietnam War was fought, while during that time, the United States and the Soviet Union was in a state of a Cold War. And of course, obviously that was a big, very heated, kind of tense era in that time. The idea of, the possibility of nuclear war was very real at that time. It was also very scary. Again, I mentioned that movie, the movie Threads. If you watch that movie, you see what it's talking about. There's also The Day After, which is also a good movie. It's also a very hard hitting movie that kind of about nuclear war. But I'm sure there's also other movies that portray, that told a story about Vietnam, which is obviously a very ugly war. But yeah, this is a video is talking about Vietnam, and I'll play the rest.
To order your first book, call now 1-800-228-2222. It will be sent to you free for 10 days. Keep it in pay just $14.95 plus shipping and handling.
Also notice here it says $14.95 for
keep the ones you want. Cancel anytime. So call 1-800-228-2222.
Anyway, so I figured just play the rest of that. But anyway, feel free to rate, comment, subscribe, ring the notification bell to get notified about new videos I post here on YouTube. I will do more videos in the near future. I'll probably, who knows, I'll probably just might do compilation videos of, maybe for time life commercials for Vietnam, or time life videos, commercials for World War II or whatever. I'll see. I might, have a couple ideas in my head of what kind of videos I can do, to try to make it entertaining. But anyway, feel free to rate, comment, subscribe, and I will see you all very soon.